Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. As Operation Green Hunt gets underway, we present an alternate view. Not what the government thinks of the Maoists or Naxalists, but the view from the other side. That's the key issue I should explore today with one of India's foremost human rights activists, Binayak Sen. Dr. Sen, the Prime Minister has often referred to the Maoists or Naxalites as the single greatest threat facing the Indian state. In fact, he's gone on record to say that it's an even greater threat than the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. Clearly, yours must be a very different view. So let me begin by asking you, how do you view or understand the Maoist struggle?
Firstly, we decry, as human rights workers, we decry all forms of violence, whether it is the violence of the state or the violence of those opposing the state.
In this instance, which in your mind is the first violence? Which is the greater?
I would just explain that with a reference to the context of the situation in the country today. Firstly, there is a chronic famine abroad in the land, and this famine envelops, according to the National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau, which is a government organization, 33% of the people in this country have clinically demonstrable chronic undernutrition, and that includes 50% of the scheduled tribes and 60% of the scheduled castes.
So is the Maoist struggle therefore, in your eyes and in your view, a response to chronic malnutrition?
It's a response to chronic poverty, which is of which malnutrition is only a part. Now, these communities which are suffering from this famine that is abroad in this land, these communities have thus far survived because of a fragile and tenuous equilibrium that they have established with their ecosystems, and which they are able to maintain because of their access to common property resources like land, water, and forest.
So when land is acquired from them and they are dispossessed, their fragile existence itself is threatened. Is that the point you're making?
Yes, their fragile existence is threatened to the point where conditions are being created which would fall well within the ambit of the United Nations definitions of genocide.
In other words, you're saying that in fact the Maoists are fighting on behalf of people to get them justice, to fight against dispossession, which you interpret in fact as a form of genocide.
Their resistance to this dispossession is the only possible response that would enable these communities which are suffering from this famine to survive.
You're saying, aren't you, and I'm repeating this because it's important we clarify and understand, that the Maoist struggle is a struggle for justice, it's a resistance against unfair and wrong dispossession. Am I right?
It is a struggle against the conditions which would lead to genocide.
You mean genocide?
I mean genocide.
You're not using that word irresponsibly?
I'm not using that word irresponsibly. The word genocide, everybody thinks that genocide only has to do with direct killing. But we cannot have the United Nations Convention's definitions on genocide include the creation of conditions, mental and physical conditions, which would render the survival of these communities under question.
All right, you interpreted for me...
And we already have a situation of chronic famine, as I have already told you.
I understand that.
And which is getting worse over time. It is not getting better, it's getting worse.
You've interpreted for me how you view the Maoist struggle. You said that it's a resistance against dispossession.
I'm not talking on behalf of the Maoists.
I understand.
Maoists.
I'm not saying you're talking
from a point of view of a human rights worker.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You're speaking for yourself.
Yes.
You've interpreted the Maoist struggle as a resistance against dispossession, as a fight for justice, as an attempt to resist genocide. The problem is that that's not the only thing the Maoists are seeking to do. The Maoists are also seeking to overthrow the Indian political system. Do you endorse that position as well?
I am committed to the Constitution of India. As a human rights worker, I am committed to the Constitution of India. And at the same time, as I said right in the beginning, we decry all forms of violence.
But this is not violence. Forgive me, I'm interrupting you because this is not violence. This is something else. Let me quote to you what Kishanji said to Tehelka on the 21st of November. He says the first goal is to gain political power to establish a new democracy. And then he adds, To create a new democratic state, one has to destroy the old one. Now, as a human rights activist, do you endorse that demand and belief?
I maintain my commitment to the values enshrined in the Constitution, one of which is equity. But
I'm asking a different question. I'm asking whether you support Kishenji's position that the new democratic state can only be created by overthrowing the old one.
Maoists will speak for themselves. I do not speak for the Maoists.
I'm not asking you to speak for the Maoists. Yes. I'm asking you whether you endorse this position of the Maoists.
I am committed to the Constitution of India. As a human rights worker, I am committed to the Constitution of India. But the Constitution is being flouted in this situation by the powers of the state. And I hold the people and the state. The people are sovereign, and the people and the state have to be held to the values of equity that are
the question is, how are they to be held to the values of the Constitution? The Maoists aren't just seeking to overthrow the existing political system to create a new democratic order. More importantly, they are committed to doing this not by means of persuasion, not by means of election, but by armed liberation struggle. To many people, that's tantamount to civil war. Once again, as someone who is sympathetic to their viewpoint, do you endorse armed liberation struggle?
The people the communities whose survival is under question, they will have to decide for themselves how they are to defend their existence.
You mean armed liberation struggle could be acceptable?
See, it is not a question of whether it is acceptable to me or to anyone else. It is the question of how these communities decide to fight for their survival.
Absolutely. The communities will answer for themselves. But I'm talking to Binayak Sen, one of India's foremost human rights activists. Let me repeat the question. Does Binayak Sen endorse armed liberation struggle?
I do not endorse violence by any party.
Okay.
Whether it is the violence of the state, I decry the violence of the state. I decry the violence of the people opposing the state.
Let me put you 2-3 critical questions which are often asked of human rights activists. As someone who perhaps is the foremost Indian human rights activist, I'm going to ask this of you. Look at the methods the Maoists use. They blow up railway tracks. They blow up telecom towers. They demolish bridges. They loot banks.
Excuse me. We do not endorse violent activity.
Do you criticize this?
Not only do we not endorse, we decry violence. We decry the violence of the state. We decry the violence of those opposing the state.
I'll come to the state in a moment's time.
Just a minute.
Just a moment. I want to get clarification.
When the state lets loose armed soldiers in these areas and talks about collateral violence in which women are shot. Sodi Sambo was shot in the thigh and brought to in Dantewada.
Dr. Sen, I'll come to the state in a moment's time. I'm interrupting you because you keep wanting to fuse the state with the Maoists. Let's, for reasons of understanding,
I'm saying that violence is not acceptable. Violence is not acceptable.
In any form.
Violence is not acceptable.
And we decry violence. When you say you decry violence, do you also condemn it and criticize the violence of the Maoists?
We have criticized violence on many occasions. We criticized the violence of the Maoists on many occasions. When Francis Induvar was beheaded, we went on public and condemned that action.
Except for the fact that Francis Induvar has been repeated by the similar beheading of Sanjay Ghosh this week. As we speak on Tuesday, the Maoists in Bengal beheaded Sanjay Ghosh in cold, inhuman killing. Do you condemn it?
We condemn all.
In the strongest possible terms?
We condemn this kind of killing under all circumstances.
Okay, the problem is that you may condemn it under all circumstances, but in fact the Maoists believe that such killing is not just acceptable and justifiable. Let me finish. Yes. You have to let me finish. They in fact believe that this is part of their system. I'm going to quote to you again Kishenji speaking to
I am not going to defend what or decry what Kishenji said. I'm here to answer for myself.
Absolutely. And
please don't pin me down to talking about the Maoists.
No, I'm asking
I am talking about famine in this country.
No, I'm asking you a different question.
Just a minute. I am talking about famine. You see, these are the huge questions that we are addressing.
Dr. Sen, I'm asking you a question that many in the audience will interpret as difficult and awkward for you to answer. Rather than let me finish the question, you're deflecting it and interrupting. Let me finish, then you answer.
Yes.
Because I think it's important as a human rights activist that your position on the policy of annihilation should be heard. The annihilation policy has been defended by Kishenji Tohelka in the following words. We say annihilation.
I decry annihilation. I decry annihilation. I do not agree with annihilation. The state is also practicing annihilation. I decry the violence of the state. Mahatma Gandhi said that when the state resorts to violence, the legitimacy of the state is destroyed. Now today
can be
just a minute.
No, you keep
Please
collapsing.
don't interrupt. Let
you
me
keep
finish.
collapsing to the state.
Let me
I will
finish.
come to the state. I've promised you I'll handle the state later. But first, I want to hear you clearly say that annihilation, which is an acceptable and justified Maoist policy, is one that you completely, totally condemn.
We decry all forms of violence.
No, but name the Maoist. Name the Maoist.
I am not going to name any party. I am saying that the state of the Maoist violence is consequence and not cause. The cause is the violence of the state, not only the violence of bullets, but the violence of genocide, which I am invoking as a responsible human rights.
I'm going to stop you at that point because you made a very important statement. You said that in fact Maoist violence is a consequence, it's not a cause. In other words, it is something that happens as a result of state violence. It is provoked by state violence. Let's take a break and come back, because many people say that is a confusion that sometimes human rights activists make, which leads them to be sympathetic to Maoists and perhaps blind to the human rights atrocities that are inflicted by Maoists on security personnel. That's the issue in a moment's time. Let's first take a quick commercial break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with India's foremost human rights activist, Binayak Sen. Dr. Sen, we ended part one by your saying that in fact Maoist violence is a consequence, it's not a cause. In other words, it's provoked by state violence. I put it to you, by that explanation, to many people you're in danger of either justifying or at least exonerating Maoist violence.
I am not interested in justifying any violence. As a human rights worker, I decry all forms of violence, the violence of the state as well as the violence of those opposing the state. Now let me finish. But we have larger issues to address here. We have the issue of famine in this country.
Dr. Sen, don't deflect me again. You did it so often in part one. I don't want you to do it again. Audiences want to hear a human rights activist explain why he not only equates Maoist violence with state violence, but seems to exonerate Maoist violence because you see it as a consequence of state violence. Let me push this further. Let's take your own example. No doubt you were wrongly charged. No doubt you were wrongly held in jail for perhaps as long as 2 years. But at the end of the day, it was the courts that released you. There was a due process that went through. You did get bail. Look at Francis Induwar, and then this week, look at Sanjoy Ghosh. There was no due process. They were killed and beheaded in cold blood. Yes. There, the Maoists were judge, jury, executioner, and hangman in one go. How can you equate the two?
Despite the decline in the integrity of the institutions of state power, I believe that the democratic institutions, that it is for human rights activists as well as for civil society as a whole to hold the state to its commitment to the institutions of democratic governance. This is absolutely clear.
I would applaud that. I would applaud that.
Yes.
But one codicil. Not only should you hold the state to its democratic commitments and its constitutional commitments, should you not similarly hold the Maoists to commitments of humanity? Let me pause. You rightly, justifiably criticize the state when the human rights of Maoists and the dispossessed are trampled upon. You call it genocide. Maybe you're right. Why are you silent when the human rights of security personnel are trampled upon by the Maoists?
We are not silent. We have declared again and again that we decry this activity. We are not silent. You talked about Francis Induwar's case. We decried, we condemned that.
But why have you not condemned Sanjay Ghosh? It was
because
repeated
Sanjay
on
Ghosh
Tuesday.
has just come in the paper today.
So how long are you going to wait? How long are you going to wait to decry it?
It is a corollary that if I am condemning Francis Indua's case, I also condemn this beheading of Sanjay Ghosh.
But it's a silent corollary. You're not making the point. You're assuming that others will take it for granted. Whereas you don't assume that when you want to criticize the security forces. You're upfront, forthright and unequivocal criticizing the government. You're silent when it comes to the Maoists.
When Sodhi Sambo is shot in the thigh, when the Dantewada people are witness to executions carried out by the security forces, we do not hear any word from the powers that be in the state, the cabinet, the ministers and the who are in charge.
So is your judgment and your criticism conditioned by what the government says on the other side?
No, I'm not saying that. Do we conclude from that these activities have the endorsement of the government, of the ministers involved? We do not conclude
but
that.
But are the standards of a human rights activist to be set by a government that he criticizes?
No.
Because that's how you're justifying your behavior.
My standards are clear. I have already condemned that.
But no, this is the point. Forgive me.
Please allow me. Please, now we have very little time left.
The reason I'm questioning you closely on this is because many people turn around and say that human rights activists, not necessarily Binayak Sen alone or only, but human rights activists take one view of atrocities committed against the Maoists and a completely different view of atrocities committed against security personnel. They say this is double standards.
There are no double standards. We decry violence of all kinds. But now let me come to the point of famine and genocide. There is a famine abroad in this land. 33% of our adult population, according to the National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau, have clinically demonstrable chronic undernutrition, a body mass index below 18.5, and the conditions that are being created as a result of widespread, massive state acquisition of their land, displacement from their access to ecosystems. Is just a minute. Let me finish. Is creating a condition for genocide that will come well within the ambit of the United Nations Conventions on Genocide.
Dr. Said, I allowed you to repeat that a second time. You made the point comprehensively in part one. I've let you do it again because clearly it's important to you.
Yeah.
But what I want to ask you in return...
It's not only to me, it should also be important to you.
It is important to me.
Yeah.
But the issue I want to ask you is a simple one. Do you think that this famine, do you think that even government policies that in your eyes justify and create the famine, justify in turn armed liberation struggle, virtually a civil war against not just the state, but the people of India? Does one justify the other?
Violence is not a legitimate way of inducting social change.
In which case then, why don't you turn to the Maoists? Why don't you turn to the Maoists with whom you have influence, with whom you have a certain measure of understanding and sympathy, and say to them that, look, you have a just cause. Millions, hundreds of millions of Indians would agree with that. But don't ruin it by trying to tackle it through violence. Give up the violence. The government says that they are prepared to have the widest ranging talks. All they're asking for is abjure violence in return.
We can only speak for ourselves. We do not speak for anyone else. We are part of the Citizens Initiative for Peace. We are taking all efforts to talk to whoever will listen and ask for in a bid to bring about peace.
Question.
But the peace cannot be the peace and acquiescence in a kinder, gentler genocide. That cannot be peace.
That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what I'm talking about.
A peace has to be a peace with justice that will enable these communities to access the guarantees of equity in the Constitution.
A peace with justice can only happen when talks begin. And the government has committed itself to the widest ranging talks with one condition: abjure violence. Do you know the response from the Maoists? That this is an absurd and irrational condition.
I am not here to talk for the Maoists.
But then will you criticize them for not abjuring violence so that talks can start? Will you criticize them for that?
We are talking to all parties, or whoever will listen, because we want to bring about peace.
You're sidestepping my question.
No, I am not.
Do you criticize the Maoists for not giving up violence?
I am not nobody is giving up violence. Neither the state is giving up violence, nor the Maoists are giving up violence. I am interested in furthering my cause, which is the cause of peace. Peace with justice.
Okay.
And that is what I am, that is what I
Do
will
you
be
see peace
responsible
happening
to.
at all? Because with both sides locked in an impasse or a standoff, do you see the situation changing?
The duty of a social activist is to be an optimist. I am optimistic about peace. I hope for peace. I believe in peace. I believe that we all have to work and struggle, not just human rights activists. The whole of society has to work for peace, has to set up a cry for peace.
On that note, we can both agree. A pleasure talking to you, even if at times it seems as if I was quarreling with you.
Thank you.